Welcome back, dear viewers. In our last tutorial on pivot tables, we saw two ways to insert a pivot table with live Odoo data into a spreadsheet. We have also looked at how to convert a static pivot table inserted from an Odoo pivot view into a dynamic pivot table that can be manipulated. If you haven't seen it yet, make sure to check it out. In this tutorial, we're picking up pretty much where we left off. We'll cover how to build and manipulate a pivot table to get the perspectives, level of detail, and insights your business needs. And we'll also look at the styling and presentation of pivot tables. Most of what we'll cover applies to building and manipulating any kind of pivot table in Odoo Spreadsheet, whether you're working with live Odoo data or not. But you'll see a few things that are only relevant when you are working with data from your database. Let's get started. So, here we are in our sales analysis spreadsheet with just the bare bones of our pivot table in the top left corner of our sheet and our pivot table properties here on the right. Before we start building our pivot table, let's take a look around. At the top of the panel, we can see the pivot ID. This is the second pivot that has been inserted into the spreadsheet, so this is pivot number 2. Our pivot table keeps this number for the lifetime of the spreadsheet, and it's how we can identify its data source in the data menu. Check out our previous tutorial about pivot tables for more about data sources. The configuration tab is where we'll be building and manipulating our pivot table. The first thing we have is the name of the pivot table, which can be edited at any time. Let's call this pivot table Product Sales by Market. And we can copy that and update the sheet name too. In a pivot table with Odoo data, model indicates which model the data is connected to. Like here, this pivot table is connected to the sales order line model. If we had inserted a pivot table from a range of data, we'd see the spreadsheet range here instead. Next, we have our columns and rows, which are essentially how we'll group our data. The measures are what it is we are actually measuring, such as total sales, or like here, just a count of the sales order lines. In a pivot table with Odoo data, the domain allows us to pre-filter the data that's retrieved from our database. Here, by default, we are seeing all records, but we could decide to restrict that using rules. We'll see that in action a little later on. If we click on the Design tab, we can see some display and style options. We'll come back to those later too. As a reminder, these properties appear as soon as we insert a pivot table via any of the possible methods, and they can be accessed at any time by clicking Data, then selecting the relevant data source. We can also access them by right-clicking any cell of the pivot table, then clicking See Pivot Properties. Now it's time to start building our pivot table. Our sales director wants to explore our sales performance at product level across the different markets we are active in. Is only interested in data for fully invoiced sales. So the first thing we are going to do is edit our domain to retrieve only the relevant data from our database. To do that, we go down to Domain, click Edit Domain, then click New Rule. Let's click on ID and then select the right field. So we can type status and select invoice status is equal to, and here we select fully invoiced. We could add other rules here too, such as to restrict the data to a particular time period, but for now, this is enough. Next, let's start adding the dimensions we need. We have a lot of individual products, so it makes the most sense to add those as rows. We'll click Add, then type product, and select it. And there we have our full list of products in ascending alphabetical order. We want to analyze sales by market, so our columns are going to be country names. However, we have a small problem. If we click Add, then type country, we see that it doesn't return a field. That's because information about the customer's country isn't stored on the sales order line model itself. It's related to the customer, which means it's stored in the contact model. So we'll create a path to the country field by instead typing customer, then clicking on the arrow here, and this shows us all the related fields on that model. So now if we type country, we can see all the markets where our products have been sold. For more on Odoo fields, including related fields, check out our tutorial on key Odoo concepts, also in this course. Back to our spreadsheet. Right now, a pivot table is just showing a count of the number of sales order line containing each product, which doesn't help us much. So let's add the measure we need. Rather than delete this count measure, we're just going to hide it by clicking the small hide icon, in case we need it later. Next, let's click Add and scroll down to select Total. And there we have our basic pivot table showing invoiced sales per product and per market. The beauty of a pivot table is that we can manipulate it to get different perspectives, change the focus of level of detail, and basically get lots of useful insights into our data. So let's take a look at some of the many possibilities we have. When we added our products as row dimension, you'll remember they appeared in ascending alphabetical order. There are a few different ways we can sort our data. First, we can change the order by sorting of dimensions like this. Another way is to sort our data based on the measure. For example, let's say we wanted to see our top products in Belgium. We can right-click on any cell in the column, then select Sort Pivot, then Descending. Our pivot table refreshes, and over here in the pivot table, if we scroll down, we can see which dimensions and which measure we are sorting by. To undo a specific sorting, we can either sort on another column or change the sorting to no sorting. When we're working with large quantities of data, it can be worth adding some additional structure to make it easier to scan your pivot table for the information you need. For example, rather than having just a list of products, we can add the product category to make a nested hierarchy. To do that, let's click Add here in the rows section, then type category and select the product category. This new dimension gets added after the first one, but we can just change the order by dragging it. And voila, we are now seeing our products grouped by category with the totals for each category shown in bold. If we wanted to, we could collapse one or more sections to give a more condensed view by clicking on this minus icon. We could also group our column dimensions. And here, there is a handy feature worth knowing about. At Apex Original, our main markets are Belgium, Spain, and France. But it would be interesting to see at a glance how our secondary markets are performing in comparison. So we'll create two groups, one with our main markets and one with all the others. To do that, we select Belgium, Spain, and France by holding Control and clicking. Then we can right-click and select Group Pivot Dimensions. This adds a new column dimension. If you get this error, just change the sorting here. Then click on Groups. The first group is the markets we just selected. So we can click on that and rename it Main Markets. Then we can click on Others group to create the other group. And just like magic, our markets are grouped. Collapsing one or both of our groups, let us change our focus and see where the opportunities and weaknesses are. Like down here in the footwear section, we can see that our sales must be very poor across our secondary markets. Do you know where pivot tables get their name from? It's because you can literally pivot or rotate the data. When we added our product category dimension earlier, we saw that we can simply drag and drop dimension. That's handy when you just want to move one dimension either within its section or to the other axis. But sometimes you might want to move all the columns to rows and vice versa at the same time to see the data from a different perspective. To do that, we'll click on the gear icon here at the top, and then we can select Flip Axis. Well, this isn't changing the actual data, it's changing our focus. Previously, our focus was on products, whereas now, especially if we collapse these category columns, we can more easily ask ourselves, how are we doing in one particular country, such as Spain, for example. Let's flip back the axis to where they were. Until now, we've been mostly playing with our dimensions to create an easy-to-navigate pivot table. Let's see how we can also manipulate the measures to gain different insights. Currently, our pivot table has two measures: the count of the sales order lines, which we've hidden, and the total invoiced sales. For the total, the type of aggregation is sum. That means each visible data point is the sum of all the invoiced sales for that specific product in the relevant market or markets. Different aggregations are possible. For example, if we select average, we're seeing the average sales amount per sale order line for that product and market. But we'll just keep sum for now. Something else we can do with measure is change how they are calculated. By default, all the values in the pivot table are shown as their actual value, with no additional calculation. But let's say we wanted to see how sales in one market are contributing to the total sales for a product. To do that, we can add a second instance of the total as a measure. And we will change how it's calculated. First, to avoid confusion, let's change the name to percentage of grand total. Then we'll click on this gear icon. Here we can choose from lots of different ways to calculate our values, and we want the percentage of grand total. Then save. Now, per product and country, we can see its contribution towards the grand total. And if we collapse our column grouping, we of course see this total and percentages aggregated per category. For example, we can see that clothing in our main markets accounts for 40.14% of total sales, while across all our secondary markets, it's only 9.76%. What if we wanted to go even further with data manipulation? Well, we could in theory use spreadsheet formulas alongside our pivot table. But there is a problem with that. If new data is added to our sheet, like a new product or a new market, then our calculations would break. Instead, we can add calculated measures. These let us use regular spreadsheet functions and any field already present in our pivot table to perform precise calculation within the pivot table itself. To see this in action, let's head back to the first pivot table we inserted into our spreadsheet and open its properties from the data menu. Here in our pivot table, we have sales figure per salesperson grouped by quarter. Let's say we wanted to see how each salesperson is performing against their quarterly targets instead, which we have here on a separate sheet. The first thing we are going to do is to add our quarterly targets to this pivot table with a first calculated measure. To do that, we can come here, click on Add, and then Add Calculated Measure. Let's rename this as Target. Then we are going to use a VLOOKUP to retrieve the quarterly targets from our other sheet. Let's get rid of this placeholder 0 here. And then we can start typing VLOOKUP here. To select the value we're searching for in our other sheet, we need to select the field, or in this case, it's going to be the user ID, which is defined here, which is the salesperson. A word of warning, because we are creating a dynamic reference here, it's crucial to select the field here and not just click on the cell. Next, we select the range. So let's open the sheet here and select the two first column. Okay. Then we have to precise the index, so we enter 2 since we get information from the second column. Then false in this case. We can then close the brackets and then click enter. So now we'll see the target per salesperson and per quarter. We are interested in seeing performance against a target, so a percentage. And for that, we'll add another calculated measure that uses the original total field and our new target field. So we are going to do the same thing again. We click on Add, select Add Calculated Measure, and we are going to call this one Percentage Achieved. This time, our formula is simply the total divided by the target. Then we press enter. And in order to see these as percentages, we can just select a cell, go to Format, and select percentage here. And there we see the percentage of the sales target achieved for each salesperson for each quarter. We can even hide these total and target fields, as they don't need to be visible for the calculation to work. The big advantage of using calculated measures as opposed to just adding our own formulas is that they are calculated automatically for every cell in the pivot table, even if our pivot table extends for a new salesperson or a new quarter. Now we have the insights we need, but let's go one step further. We are going to quickly add some conditional formatting to make our pivot table easier to scan. To do that, select the whole sheet, then go to Format, Conditional Formatting. Click Add Another Rule, and we are going to add some color dots so we can see at a glance when targets were fully reached and when they were less than 80% reached. So let's select Icon Set, then the dots. The green dot is going to be for the targets fully reached or exceeded. So this dot should be displayed when the value is greater than 1. And we set the value to be a number. The yellow dot will be for 80% or more. So the value is greater or equal than 0.8 as a number as well. Everything below 80% will have a red dot. Then we can click on Save. Now we can see at a glance whether or not our salespeople have been meeting their targets. We covered a lot in this tutorial about configuring and manipulating pivot tables in Odoo Spreadsheet. The last thing we'll touch is on the Design tab in the Properties panel. So let's open our pivot table properties and go to the Design tab. Here we have various options for what information is displayed and how your pivot table looks. For example, in the display options, we can choose not to show totals, which in our case probably makes sense. In the pivot table style section, we can also customize how the pivot table looks. For example, we could add banded rows or choose one of the other pre-configured styles. Well, that's it for this video. In this second tutorial on pivot tables, you've learned how to configure and manipulate pivot tables in Odoo Spreadsheet. Now you're ready to dive in your data and get the insights you need to drive your business forward. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.